Still, we might wonder, what does this have to do with epistemology as we thought of it in this class? Even if this notion, even if this idea of theory choice does have some connection to feminism, if Longino is right about that, what does it matter for the stuff we've talked about in our class? One of your classmates asked this in the following way. In a similar way, I've also wondered what distinguishes a true feminist epistemologist from a standard epistemologist. The way that Longino phrases it is that the difference will be in practice instead of content. How would someone who's seeking the truth to the best of their ability truly change to do this in a feminist way? Also, if the content remains the same, what's the difference of the feminist and non-feminist epistemologist? I don't see any revelations being made on Gettier problems, for instance, by approaching them from a feminist perspective. So that's what your classmate said. And so we have looked at the example of the theory choice, and I do think the idea is you come to a different conclusion about which theory to accept because you use this feminist process. Now, feminism, Longino will say, doesn't decide which particular conclusion ahead of time, but if you use a feminist sort of inspired process or method, you might think different virtues are more important in theory choice, and that might lead you to adopt a different one theory rather than another in science. But of course, many of you really care about the part of the question where you're asking, well, what about Gettier cases, justification, skepticism? And so again, it's just before we say anything about this particular case, it's important that Longino isn't prescribing a particular view on any of these. She's saying it's about the method you use. And I have to be honest, when I think about Gettier cases too, like I just don't know. Like I don't know how this would affect Gettier cases. It doesn't honestly seem like it would very much. It's a little bit less clear for topics in justification, for instance. Some people think about that when you think in a feminist sort of way about justification, you stop looking at particular beliefs or individual believers, and you start thinking about communities being justified or whole practices of inquiry being justified. So you start thinking about justification in terms of individuals in communities and not sort of individual thinkers with pieces of evidence. You often see this when you read feminist literature and epistemology, criticism of a sort of Cartesian notion of this individual thinker just thinking in their own mind about the way things are. Really, I think feminist thinkers often say we should be paying attention to the way inquiry happens collaboratively, to the way we're sharing knowledge with each other. And that might lead to different views of what makes people justified. There's similarly, on the same vein, there's a tendency to be anti-skeptical among feminist epistemologists. So because it's sort of impractical, because it doesn't take into account the social relations we have with others. Now, what I should say in addition to how it might affect the questions we've talked about, and maybe even this may even be more important, is that much of the method is to think about new places where feminist concerns actually do seem to matter much more clearly, rather than just rethinking the old questions, the Gettier problem, for instance, in a sort of feminist way. It might be that who gives a crap about the Gettier problem when we start thinking in feminist terms? Really, maybe we should be thinking about other things like doing justice to how maybe if women have different conceptual schemes or different ways of thinking than men do, maybe we should think about epistemological questions that do justice to these differences of conceptual theme. Maybe we should think about testimony and how women maybe are given less weight to their views in testimony than men are. Maybe we should think about, you hear this notion now talk about a lot about lived experiences. How do lived experiences relate to things like data or quantifiable data or measurement? How do these things relate? What are the relative epistemic statuses of these? How do they play as evidence? These might all be questions or issues that seem clearly epistemological, but are ones that maybe aren't central to the tradition of epistemology in the past, but maybe should be when we start thinking in feminist ways. And I should just note, one of the things we're going to read next week has a lot to do with the notions, a little bit about conceptual schemes, but more about testimony and how that is affected by feminist thinking.